Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating puzzle, one that kind of pits a group's size against its sense of cultural security. We're going to unpack why a small, isolated nation can feel incredibly confident, while a group with millions of people can feel like it's on the brink of disappearing. So, yeah, let's get right into it.
So here it is, the central paradox we're going to explore. I mean, how is it even possible that a tiny population, one you'd think would be statistically vulnerable, feels totally stable and thriving, while a massive demographic, living in a much larger society, feels profoundly insecure? It just seems completely backward, right? But the answer, well, it reveals a ton about what actually makes a group feel safe. To get to the bottom of this, we're going to compare two very different groups. On one side, you have these small, sovereign nations up in the North Atlantic. Think Iceland, the Faroe Islands. Despite their tiny populations, they have this really strong sense of cultural pride. And on the other side, well, we have the Western working class in places like the US and Europe. We're talking about a group that numbers in the tens of millions. Yet it's where you hear a lot of anxiety about culture and these replacement theories.
So, where does this huge difference in security even come from? Well, the first piece of the puzzle isn't really about psychology, it's about structure. It all starts with the power of having clear, defined boundaries. The key advantage for groups like Icelanders is this one word, sovereignty. And this isn't just some dry political term. It's actually a powerful cultural shield. It means you have the authority to govern yourself, to protect your culture with actual laws, and to control who comes in and who goes out. It's basically an entire institutional framework for self-preservation.
The best way to think about sovereignty is like a cultural moat. For these North Atlantic nations, that moat is made of very real things. I mean, you've got geographic isolation. They're literally on remote islands. They have political borders that they control. They have an official language that's protected and required for everything. And there's a really high barrier to entry. It's not like you can just decide to become Icelandic tomorrow. The Western working class, on the other hand, is a demographic spread all over the place. They just don't have a moat like that.
Okay, so that's the structure. Now let's dig into how that influences the psychology of these two groups. You might think being small or scarce is always a weakness, but it turns out scarcity can be seen in two completely opposite ways. And this is where it gets really interesting, because you have this fundamental conflict. In economics, scarcity creates value, right? A rare diamond is worth way more than a common stone. But in sociology, for a group that's part of a bigger society, scarcity can feel terrifying. It can feel like you're losing power, losing your voice, and losing control over your own destiny. So this leads to two totally different outcomes. Icelanders, they embrace their scarcity. It makes them unique, creating this sort of boutique identity where their language and culture are treated like these rare jewels that have to be protected. But for the Western working class, becoming a smaller piece of the pie isn't seen as becoming unique. It's seen as losing their dominant position, their cultural centrality. And this brings us to an absolutely crucial point. It's so easy to assume this anxiety is just about the raw numbers changing. But if you look at the history, that's not the whole story. The real issue isn't the demographic ratio itself, it's the social relationship between the groups in that ratio. Just take a look at this data from the US. Back in 1790, not long after the country was founded, the non-white population was almost 20%. Then, after waves of European immigration, that number hit a low point around 1920. Some people call it peak whiteness. But here's the real kicker. By 1980, the ratio is almost exactly back to where it was in 1790. So if the numbers were basically the same, why did it feel so different?
Well, because in 1790, that 19.3% of the population was largely enslaved. They had no legal rights, no social standing. They posed absolutely no threat to the status of even the poorest white citizen. Today, minority groups are free citizens. They're peers, voters, competitors in the job market. The anxiety isn't about sharing a space, it's about sharing power and status within that space.
The brilliant sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois had a term for this, the psychological wage. It's the idea that, historically, even the poorest members of the dominant group were paid this sort of non-monetary wage of just status. They were always assured of their superior social standing. As other groups gained civil rights and legal equality, that psychological wage vanished. And for some, that felt like a really profound loss. And that really brings us to the heart of it. The feeling of insecurity we're talking about is less a fear of literally going extinct and much more a fear of losing status. The fear of being culturally sidelined.
This quote from our source material just captures the emotional reality perfectly. It's not about vanishing. It's about feeling like you've been demoted from the main character to just a supporting role in your own country's story. The whole national narrative is changing, and your place in it just doesn't feel as certain anymore.
So let's just pull all of this together. What we've seen is that the source of confidence is just fundamentally different for these two groups. For Icelanders, it's intrinsic. It comes from the inside. It's built on their unique language, their ancient literature, their shared heritage. But for the Western working class feeling this anxiety, identity has often been defined extrinsically by who they are not. So when that other group gains an equal footing, an identity built like that feels like it's under attack.
And that really leaves us with this final question to chew on. What truly anchors a group's identity for the long haul? Is it just about the raw numbers, about how many of you there are? Or is it about the strength, the confidence, and the power of the story you tell about yourselves? The tale of these two groups seems to suggest it's the narrative that holds all the power.